Welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Justice with the JFJ team. I want to say thank you so much and happy Tuesday to those who are listening via Radioland and those who are joining us on JFJ's YouTube page. My name is Michael Jackson, Executive Director of JFJ.
And I'm Jade Williams, the Policy and Advocacy Specialist at JFJ.
Now, it's an interesting week, I would say. Lots of things happening in the news within the human rights landscape. We're going to be touching on them briefly. And we're also going to be continuing with our theme for May, where we celebrate our children, we protect them, and we provide some public education to our listeners around the issues that affect the nation's children, and again, what we can do to ensure that they are so protected. So in continuing with that, we're going to be examining, Jade and listeners, how exactly we can deal with children as both victims and perpetrators of sexual violence in the country. And an issue that I would say culturally we grapple with. And we're going to be joined by State Minister in the Ministry of Health, the Honorable Juliet Cuthbert Flynn. And we're also going to be joined by DCP Jacqueline Dillon, who is the head of the Domestic Violence Intervention Center. DSP.
Yes.
It's okay, Jay. You don't have to whisper to correct me on ear, you know. My ego not that fragile, yes?
Okay.
So we so note the correction, all right? So as usual, we're going to be starting out with our human rights recap of the week. And there are certain things happening that I hope we're paying attention to. The head of the United Nations, the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, he left for New York after a 2-day visit within the country. He met with the Honorable Prime Minister, and it was a good visit, I would say. Several things were discussed, such as climate justice, how we deal with the matter of the climate crisis affecting small developing countries such as Jamaica, but importantly, the instability that is happening in Haiti. And Jamaica has taken a lead role in dealing with the issues in Haiti, and the conversation continues in terms of should security forces be deployed by other Caribbean countries when you talk about the historical ills that have faced Haiti. So that's a conversation that we expect to continue, and why there's some reticence by other countries in deploying security forces, because I think democracy is under threat in Haiti, and it certainly needs dealing with. There were six former heads of Caribbean countries that have formed some sort of committee that will assist with this political transition to aid with the stability in Haiti. I don't have the names readily offhand now, but it's something that we're going to be watching closely, because Haiti is a neighbor of Jamaica, and we can't just look at it and say what happened over there so we don't pay attention to. So that conversation will continue. Also, last week, I'm not sure, I didn't get to go. I'm not sure, Jade, if you went to
Unfortunately, I wasn't able to go, but I got many reviews.
That was the expo that was put on by the Jamaica Constabulary Force. And the theme says people, quality, and technology. I had friends who went with their children. I had a funeral and other obligations. And the children enjoy themselves. And I thought it was a nice display from law enforcement in terms of letting the public know what they do. But for us at JFJ, while we were happy to see what was on display and officers singing and dancing with the children and the children having fun, and I thought it was good that you heard youngsters saying, I want to be a police officer, because I think you need that pride, that sense of the officers being someone that you would want to be like when you grow up. But as human rights organizations, we also take a step back. And we have to ask some of the hard questions that we have been putting forward. We saw body cameras on display. We saw other technology on display. And our questions are, how many of them have been deployed? How is it being utilized? We saw Indicom head, Hugh Faulkner, asking some of these same questions. And we know that Indicom, I think 2 weeks ago, said that they received some footage from body-worn cameras. But when you look at the usage of state of public emergency and some of the stronger policing methods being proposed by the government, We have to ensure that every single law enforcement officers deployed in these communities are wearing body-worn cameras, because it protects not just the citizens, but also the security forces themselves.
And I don't know if I can add to that point just
Please.
a little, Mikkel. Just from our perspective, we have been, engaging with the JCF through trainings, through different discussions.
I think you trained, some 50 officers in the past 2 weeks?
Yes. And some of the concerns that they have raised have to do with a similar thing that we're talking about, something that maybe the expo would have gone to addressing, which is the perception of the force. And while we had the discussion, of course, there was exchange, and we acknowledged that some of that perception is valid. But one of the challenges that the officers themselves have is that when they are acting lawfully, and it is then their word against a citizen who feels slighted. They
the
feel
10-second clips on social media and so on.
Right, where clips are doctored or edited so that officers appear to be acting unlawfully. They have a challenge with that. And in that discussion, they would have given their need for some objective evidence, wanting those
so the
cameras.
Officers want the cameras at this stage.
They do, because at this point, they think that they are doing good work, and that work is being hindered by the outside perception.
All right, got you. The last thing that is evident, 2 state of public emergency were declared this morning. You would recognize that no more press conferences are being called. We don't have an opinion on that matter. But what we are urging the government to do, because the crime rate is very high, we already know JFJ's objection to the state of public emergency being used in this way. We don't need to ventilate that again. That matter is before the Court of Appeal now with the Everton Douglas case. But what I will say is to the government of Jamaica, when you in fact declare a state of emergency, then we urge you to ensure that the regulations are so published at the time of declaration to ensure that the citizens are aware of their rights that are being curtailed, and they are aware of the powers that law enforcement officers have under the SOE. That is something that I believe is very important that the government improves upon if it continues to utilize SOE in this routine manner.
All right.
So over to you, Jade.
Yes. So we are going to go into our weekly right of the day as well as our trivia question for the week. So our right of the day for this week is coming from, again, the Convention of the Rights of the Child. And a little later, Mikkel, I'm hoping to have a discussion with you about a pertinent case that considers some of these conventions.
Tafari Morrison matter on the mandatory minimum.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. But today's right of the day says, every child alleged or accused of having infringed the penal law has at least the following guarantees. 1, to be presumed innocent until proven guilty. 2, to be informed promptly and directly of the charges against him or her, and if appropriate through his or her parents or legal guardians, and to have legal or other appropriate assistance in the preparation and presentation of his or her defense. And 3, to have the matter determined without delay by a competent, independent, and impartial authority or judicial body in a fair hearing according to the law. And what this right is really doing is giving children the same level of due process that adults get when they come in conflict with the law. So you have the right to be innocent until proven guilty, to be able to defend yourself and to understand what you're defending yourself from, and to also have the matter determined by the proper authorities. And now we go straight on to our trivia question for the week, which is, what is the minimum term one must serve for rape before parole is considered? So what is the minimum term one must serve for rape before parole is considered? And you can respond on our social media pages at Jamaicans for Justice, or you can send us a WhatsApp at 2397583. The first correct answer is the winner.
All right. Thank you so much, Jade. So to move things along, as we stated at the start of the program, we're going to be discussing children as both perpetrators and victims of sexual violence. And we are going to be joined by the Honorable Juliet Cuthbert-Flynn and DSP Jacqueline Dillon. Now, when we look at the studies over the years, we see that there is a pervasive issue of sexual abuse of children in Jamaica. In 2020, the Child Protection Family Services Agency, CPFSA, received 9,800 cases of abuse against children, with sexual abuse accounting for 20% of those cases. Approximately 2,000 to 3,000 reports of sexual abuse were received by the National Children's Registry every year, and from January to June 2021, there were 1,203 reports of sexual abuse by children. I hope DSP would be able to give us some updates on these numbers when we have her on.
Well, recently there have been several high-profile and alarming reports of sexual violence against children. However, the issue is that the perpetrators are also children. So in January 2021, we saw a 17-year-old boy being charged with rape and grievous sexual assault in Westmoreland. In September of 2022, we saw another 17-year-old who was convicted of an offense that took place in 2018, rape and murder of a 9-year-old girl. In 2023, we have also seen several incidents. We saw 2 teenage boys being charged with rape coming out of St. Elizabeth, and in that same month, another 14-year-old boy in St. Thomas charged with the rape of a 10-year-old. Even this month of May, we saw 2 17-year-old boys being arrested and charged with the assault of a classmate in Clarendon.
You know, last week, and I don't want to fully go into this, but last week we saw those, I would only use the word disgusting comments that were made at the PNP headquarters. And when you look at commentary such as those, I think we have to raise some questions in terms of how we are contributing as adults to this culture of denigrating women, of not understanding consent among our youngsters, and how that is translating in the socialization process. So I think as we tackle this topic for today, we're going to have to be delving a little bit deeper into these issues. How can we help as parents with comprehensive sexual education that is age appropriate? What more can be done in schools to prevent the crime and to ensure that when children come in conflict with the law for a serious offense such as these, how do you address the matter?
Yes.
I think these are some of the hard questions that we're going to be probing when we return after the break. Do we have our guest on?
Okay.
So we'll take the break, and then when we return, we have the conversation. Welcome back to Let's Talk Justice. We are discussing a very critical topic that really affects all Jamaicans. And I know when we read the news headlines around reports of rape, it really shocks the public conscience. But even more so when in some of those instances you look at the age of the perpetrator, 14 years old, that I remember one case in particular, I think you mentioned it, Jade, in your commentary, where the police was questioning that little boy. He gave the wrong name because he was apparently, what's the word I'm looking for? The police had questioned him before in several other matters, and he gave the wrong name, which means it's quite clear on what he's doing, So these matters have really been shocking the public's conscience. And we're going to be discussing again children as perpetrators of sexual violence, but also as victims and what we can do. We're joined by State Minister in the Ministry of Health and Wellness, the Honorable Juliet Cuthbert-Flynn. Minister, good afternoon and welcome to the show.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. I know you have Parliament, so we have to... how long do we have you for?
No. Well, no. Parliament doesn't start until 2, but...
Yes.
I'm already... I'm trying to find a room.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining. I know this is a topic that you're quite passionate about. So when you look at these reports, let me just ask, what is the reaction that you have when you see some of these news reports coming out?
It's very disturbing, to say the least. And, you know, as a mother, and I know all mothers, they probably just cringe, especially if they have small children. This last one with a 7-year-old, my daughter is 6, almost 7. And, the images that we heard on the radio, how they found her, it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking. And then to find out that the perpetrator, is possibly mentally challenged. it's even more disturbing, because we have to think about the mental wellness, I guess,
Yes.
of the nation. When you think about Jamaica is small, and so when you hear of these things, when you live in another country and it's a huge country and it doesn't really affect you that much, but when you live here and you hear the news and sometimes the person, we have to think about the mental well-being of our people and the society.
Yes. You're correct.
It's rather disturbing.
Yeah. Thanks, Minister. DSP Dillon is now on. DSP?
Yes, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much.
Yes.
We're joined by Minister Cuthbert Flynn.
As well.
Good afternoon, Minister.
If you could,
Good afternoon, all.
Great. If you could just paint a picture for us in terms of what's happening on the ground when you think about the topic, children as victims and perpetrators of sexual violence. Any statistics, what is happening on the ground that you can advise us on?
Well, I can't speak to statistics. I don't have that readily available from where I sit. However, based on what we are seeing on the ground, we have a number of children who comes in conflict with the law, whether through being a victim of sexual abuse or being the perpetrator. And that has been happening for a long period of time. However, we find that children tend to mimic what society has, or what is happening within the home, or what is happening in society. And therefore, what we see happening is more of these cases coming to the fore now more than ever.
I have to ask, what do you think is influencing that rise? Is it just the perpetuation of the same kind of crime in adult spaces, or something more that we're not seeing?
I think one of the reasons for more children getting involved in sexual violence, sexual abuse cases, is that the society is one that depicts a lot of sexual activities. You see it right around you. You see it on social media. You see it in the home. So it's out there. And what is happening is a lot of children are left to manage on their own. They become adults at an early age. And because of that, the kind of guidance that you would expect in communities and in homes are not necessarily there. Many children are living as adults within their own homes and community because the family is not there for them. The proper guidance, back in the days, that a village grows children. That's not what is happening anymore. And so children are left exposed to a number of things that they ought not to be exposed to. They are left unprotected. They are not guided by adults. And so the persons who sometimes guide them are persons who you really don't want around your children. So the kind of care and protection that a nation ought to give to our children is really lacking in the household. And many of what you see is happening is because of the lack of proper parenthood in homes.
Yeah. Minister, to you, one of the things that we've really, and DSP touched on it, lack of proper parental guidance, and perhaps when that influence is there is not the right influence. You remember some of the unsavory practices at primary school
Yes.
with the mirrors being placed between the young ladies' legs and those sort of things, or we're so caught up with the fear of our children perhaps being gay that when they have behavior that they ought not to be displaying, we're just happy. I heard a parent say one day, at least me know me picnic straight. That was a comment that the father made. So I don't know what your perspective is around parental guidance and the community support on this particular matter.
I have to agree with the officer, DSP. I have to agree with him because I grew up in the 60s and 70s. And yes, you could dance and you wind up your body and you do your thing. And there were a lot of children at that time growing up in one room. The one-room picnic that probably sees everything. I grew up in but we didn't have any men in the household. Of course, that was probably a good thing for me.
The big yard, I grew up in one as well,
right.
yes.
I shared a bed with my sister and my great-grandmother. and my cousin was a boy. He was in the other room. But I was not exposed to that. But again, he mentioned the village would raise the child. I see now the difference where the parents are way younger, and the children are mimicking what they see the parents doing. I mean, I have seen in my constituency, just gone to in a community, and you hear the kind of music, the lewd and crude kind of music. I mean, very explicit. And I'm not a shy person. And when I hear some of the things, I'm like, there's a child, there are children around. How can you? And I have to tell them to stop because they see nothing wrong with that. And so he's right. The children are very much exposed to a lot of things that, you know, the crudeness, you know, it was tempered, I believe, when I was growing up. And so it's a different society, but I don't think we are doing what is necessary for this generation to not be exposed to the sexual, the explicit and raw things that we see out there. And again, we saw the rise during COVID, the number of sexual abuse cases or just abuse cases rising. We saw that with the pandemic. And, you know, I have to think that our society is very unwell because a lot of these children, we saw the statistic where over from 2000, I can't remember, 2011 to present, there was like 6,000 rape cases reported. But again, the rape cases, a lot of them are not reported because because of backlash, or they think nothing is going to happen. And so, you know, we have to really sit as a nation and really think about what is happening with our children and how that is even affecting them as adults, or how is that going to affect them as adults? Are they getting counseling after their abuse, whether it's sexual abuse or physical abuse from their guardians or parents? We must really take stock and look at what is happening in our society and do a little bit more.
Thanks, Minister. But, you know, one of the things, a youngster challenged me on this, because I grew up on the 90s dancehall music. And I don't think you can get any slacker than that period, really. So I think the question is, what has changed, you know, for us to be seeing this type of dynamic, and what can we do, really? So I don't know, DSP, if there's anything that is being done within the JCF, the Domestic Violence Intervention Center, to kind of bridge between domestic violence matters and what we see our youngsters doing within the communities.
Before I touch on what the JCF has been doing through the Domestic Violence Intervention Center, let us remember, we have many children growing children.
Yes,
the fact is that we have normalized some acts. Yes, I was born in the 70s, and I grew up with the culture of listening to dancehall and reggae in the 90s.
Yes.
The fact is, you had guidance as to what you are to listen to and what you are not to listen to. When you look at social media and see adults, you know, gyrating on children and jeering them along to do the explicit kind of dance, and when you look at how young men, boys approach young girls and how they treat them, they are mimicking what they see in their communities and what they see in their homes and what they learn on social media. Because there's nobody to say to them, this is not the appropriate way.
Yes.
Yeah.
And for the JCF, it is an issue because everything that affects law enforcement becomes an issue for the JCF. And whilst you may have the various laws, one of the problems is that persons are silent. The stigma attached to being sexually molested, the stigma attached to rape within communities. But at the other end, there are no stigma attached to a young girl who's having a relationship with under the age of 16, who can't give consent to have a relationship, who is sexually active, and many of them are running away from homes when they are in a home where they cannot, or they are deterred from doing these kind of activities. So for the JCF, it's more about educating the public around sexual offences and proper parenting, and the Community Safety and Security Branch, under which stakeholder engagement falls, has been actively doing that.
Yes.
The SISOCA is also actively engaging communities on safe practices, because let us be realistic. When you tell a child not to have sex, or they're going to go out and do it anyway. And if a young man asks for sex and he's not giving it willingly and he feel that he really wants it, he's going to behave like an adult.
Yes.
Yes.
So for us, it's more about that partnership with the private sector, community groups, and other organizations to ensure that we educate the public on some of these things, educate children about safety and security, because again, it goes back to safety and security. A lot of these sexual violations happen with people that children know.
Yes.
They're no strangers.
DSP, hold that thought for me. Minister, just stay with us for a few more minutes. We're going to take the break, and then when we return, we pick up with the discussion.
Welcome back to Let's Talk Justice. We're having an engaging and important discussion on children as both victims and perpetrators of sexual violence. And we're joined by Minister Cuthbert Flynn and DSP Dillon. I just want to pick up with you, Minister. We've been talking about what we can do to help address this issue. And a repeated thread is, parents need to be more involved. Can you just elaborate, like what kinds of things can parents implement to help curb this kind of issue?
Right, and I think, with the Child Care and Protection Act also, that is there really to strengthen and to, as far as the protection of and to promote children's rights. But I think parents, as we said, they have the primary responsibility for their children. And what we have to do is to reinforce at an early age to let the children understand that certain acts, it's just not okay. And so I think we are, we should teach properly how they should be safe, how they should protect themselves. I think we should teach them at an early age to report their abuser. And we should also give them that support, because if the support is not there and put in place, then they're not going to report it. So I think the children will have to feel safe enough. I know that we've instituted a 211 hotline for children to report abuse, but I still think we can go a little bit further and do some more as far as getting in the faces of these children to let them understand that the state is there to actually guide and to protect them. And the parents have to come on board and join in with this to know that this is how these acts will affect your children in the future. We have to show the outcome of what is going to happen, and it is a direct thing of what's happening in our society now. We wonder sometimes why we're so angry. There are probably a lot of us walking around that were sexually or physically abused as children, and we had no out. We didn't get any counseling. We didn't get any kind of mentoring to say how
we weren't
to
believed
deal with
either. Minister.
Right, you're right. We weren't believed. So sometimes kids would tell their parents and they would run them. And so they have to feel supported. And so we can talk all we want to say we need to tell them to report it, but they must feel supported. So that support system must be in place to say, if it is that you know that you're abused, if it is that you are abused in whichever way, then you need to then call this number or report it here. They must then be supported once they do make that call to follow up with that.
Yeah,
or it's going to continue.
Thanks, Minister. And I want to add, in very simple terms to the parents listening in, this auntie and uncle business for everybody who come in contact with a child, I'm suggesting that you cut it out. They're not blood relatives, they're not even close friends of yours, and you walk around having the child calling this person auntie, uncle. So I think we have to, be a little bit more conscious about things like that.
Yes.
And, the minister, you touched on something that I want to add to as well. Believing and having that conversation. My son used to tell me things about the safety circle If you remember those things,
Yes.
the good touch, the bad touch. But we
Yes,
use the
yes.
right words, the correct words, the biological terms. I think we call things pee-pee-teely and all of these type of things, and children don't know the body parts.
Yeah.
So I just want to add to that conversation a little bit. And before we shift to DSP, or as we shift to DSP, and Minister touched on it as well, not everything requires a legislative response. Yes, you want strong laws, but I like where the JCF is going. Community interventions,
Yes.
engaging parents, engaging the children, because I think you need a sociocultural shift in the country. So I don't know
Yes.
if DSP you want to elaborate on that a little bit more.
All right, so the JCF, again, through various mediums. So we have been using our Safe School program to educate parents, teachers, and children in school about safety and security. It also includes safe touches, what it is that are wrong, and why it is that if something is happening to you that you do not feel comfortable with, who are the persons that you can talk to? And then we also, outside of school, we use the police youth club, and that's another community intervention within communities. And these are ways that we use to educate children. I often refer a case that we have at the Domestic Violence Intervention Center, that the first case we had were of two children, 7 and 9, who came to ask for help for their parents. And persons do not understand that children live what they learn.
Yes.
So it's a matter of having a conversation. Children are not as fool as we think they are, They understand if we talk to them.
Yes. All right, thank
Right,
you.
thank you.
Last word from the minister before we close.
And you're
Another
right.
question.
As I said, I have a 6-year-old, and I've taught her that her mommy and daddy, we should only touch her private areas when we're bathing her, when she's used the bathroom,
Yes.
only certain. And if the touch doesn't feel okay, that she should report it.
Yes.
And once she feels uncomfortable. And I think parents must have those conversations. However, who are the parents that we're dealing with now?
Right.
Yeah.
So that is another story. That is another kind of conversation that we must now talk. I think the parenting council needs to come on board with this to try. We have to do something with parenting in Jamaica, because it is causing a lot of other problems, societal problems, I believe.
Yes. But before we close out, I'm not sure. One of the big issue for us, and either one of you can touch on it, is our children understanding consent. My son and I, we have that conversation. He's 14 and I have to be playing chaperone, taking him on dates and these type of things, right? Which is not how we grew up, You keep your boyfriend business to yourself. But I like where we're going, where we can have these frank discussions with our children. And I teach him consent. I'm not sure, DSP or minister, from where you sit, if you think that's something that perhaps we need to have a little bit more discussion around, whether in the schools or elsewhere.
If I may, I think we
Please.
do, but I also think that we need to get the parents involved in it.
Yes.
Because many of these parents are young people. They have children as teenagers. They themselves do not have the requisite parenting skills. And people may be listening and saying, but when I was a parent, that I didn't learn how to parent. Things and times different.
Yes.
There are changes. And so we have to move with the time. And parents, a lot of parents are working. They leave the children on their own to grow. So we have to find the time as a nation, as communities, as families, to engage our children in meaningful discussion about the things that affect them, and create that avenue where they can go for help when they need the help.
Yeah. All right, thank you. Minister, last word to you before we...
I totally agree. I think we have to have a shift in society. I think we must now stop thinking about what happened back in our day. This is a new day. It's a new set of, it's a new generation. And I think we must now teach. I had a grandmother and a great-grandmother. How many, and they're older, how many of these young mothers have that kind of, extended family to really guide them? Were they guided? I think we need to look at all of those and to say, we now must guide these parents who just don't have the know-how. And I think if we do that and get more involved as community leaders, as community organizations, and with the police, of course, I think we can see a difference and a shift in society. If we sit and do nothing, we're going to continue to read about these horror stories in our newspaper or to hear about them in our communities. We must now all come together to make that difference in our society.
Agreed. Thank you both so much. And we really appreciate the perspectives and we look forward to having you here again. That was State Minister Juliet Cuthbert-Flynn and DSP Jacqueline Dillon of the Domestic Violence Intervention Center.
And Mikhail, I am boiling because...
All right. Thank you again and we look forward. So the interview has ended. We have 2 minutes before the break.
Yes, we do.
All
So
right.
I wanted to say, as they were talking about the engagement of parents in children and how that can affect their participation in sexual violence crimes, I just think about criminality in general, because we are having this situation where a lot of our youth are caught up in serious criminality by varying means.
Are
and
you wondering what's happening, what the underlying issues are? And
yes, and I saw a recent case, topical case that
one that you were following, I'm sure.
Following closely. But the Privy Council recently gave a decision in the case of Tafari Morrison, who was a 16-year-old at the time that he was arrested and charged, convicted, for a slew of crimes, including illegal possession of firearm and so on. And his claim was really challenging the mandatory minimum sentence that he received in the matter, which we can talk more about that aspect after the break. But right now, coming out of that conversation we just had, one of the issues that arose in his case was the influence that he had, which I'm hearing from different sources. It was a family member that had been previously involved in criminality that kind of influenced him into this position. And then what do we do?
But Jaden, I always ask the question, what would make a child behave in a particular manner?
Yeah.
And I think that's what we really need to tackle, the underlying issues,
Yes.
the core causes of these matters. And I've stated it publicly that I hope we can seek audience, we must, with the National Parenting Commission, to really get a sense of what they're doing with the parents through meaningful parental engagement and training sessions and these things. We are opposed to excessive mandatory minimum for the different reasons, and we're going to be talking about it, as you said, after the break. But I always ask the question, and let me say it in patois now, because we said it in English before. What could I make one little pitney take up a gun? What could I make one little pitney tell lie to the police?
Yes.
If say, this is my wrong name, because you know you were involved in about 6 other counts of rape. A teenager.
That's somebody that was trained.
What could I make?
Yeah.
As my grandmother would say down by St. Anne.
We
But we take the break, yeah.
Welcome back to Let's Start Justice. Before the break, we started having a discussion on Tafari Morrison, and just to remind our listeners, if you want to join in the conversation, you can call into the studio at 676-4996, or you can send us a WhatsApp message at 2397983 with your comments. We're also streaming live on YouTube, so you can comment there, and we will try our best to respond. So we were having a discussion before the break on the recent Privy Council decision for Tafari Morrison. And while we acknowledge that area of it to do with his criminality and how we would kind of address that kind of issue before it gets there, we do want to have a discussion about the mandatory minimum decision in particular. And I think one of the things, Mikhail, that I wanted to challenge came out of some statements I heard from our Justice Minister.
Yes, the Minister had released a statement to indicate that this is vindication of the government's use and future use of increased mandatory minimums for serious offences.
You know, I don't want to pass a threshold of disrespect or anything.
No, you can't. not in your JFJ capacity at all.
But what I would say is that that is not necessarily what came out of the judgment. I'm struggling to get that conclusion out of the judgment. I would say.
I've heard different attorneys speak on the matter. Mm-hmm. I know our interim board chair, John Clark, who is an attorney at law. He was on another radio program giving his reaction. And I think when you read at least 2 paragraphs in that judgment, I don't have it readily at hand. I think paragraph 55 was one that was referenced to indicate that when you look at the ruling from the Privy Council and what they said, and it was something that at JFJ we spoke about a few years ago actually, and most recently, that the circumstances of Mr. Morrison's case perhaps would not have given rise to the threshold to say that inhumane treatment was at play. Mm-hmm. And it was on that basis, the circumstance of this particular case, that the Privy Council ruled in the way that it did.
Yes.
And having read the judgment, it was a sound judgment in our estimation.
Yes.
Disappointing for some, but sound when you look at the circumstance of this case.
Yes.
What the Privy Council said, however, that there is a possibility for future cases to be challenged based on their own circumstances. So the language used left it wide open for future challenges to be made.
Yes. In fact, they specifically said that mandatory minimums themselves, as applied to children in this way, they cannot definitively rule that it's not something that can be challenged again. That's
So I from our standpoint, I don't see where the glee may be for some. And I know some people were on social media challenging where is JFG on the matter, but we spoke on the matter, and there was a Gleaner article that covered our position. And I want to be very clear that when it comes to mandatory minimum, it exists already in law. So mandatory minimums in and of itself is not unconstitutional. It's how it is applied.
Right.
And the impact it may have, that may very well determine that its use in this particular way may be unconstitutional. And it really runs contrary as well to certain conventions to which we're signatory. For example, the Conventions of the Rights of the Child, where as best as possible, based on the unique circumstances, you want to keep a child in prison for the shortest time possible.
Actually, because it's supposed to be a last resort.
The last resort.
Yes.
But we know that there are serious offenses that must be considered as well. So the best interest of the child must always be balanced with public safety. That's what JFG has maintained. And that's the reason that judicial discretion is needed, that latitude to look at the unique circumstances of each case to see was there any influence at play. That's why a social inquiry report and so on is needed, The judge look at it, look at the cognitive development level of that child. How intelligent that child is. And when I say intelligent, I don't mean bright spot, go to school. I mean the capacity of that child to determine what other mitigating or aggravating factors were at play. And then you make a decision. You have to give the judge that latitude.
And, one thing I'll say, the Privy Council went through an intellectual exercise in the judgment where they considered the matter as though they had not, there was no minimum sentence. And at the end, their consideration would have led to a 13-year sentence, which was still less than the minimum sentence imposed, which was 15.
And they did say it wasn't that far off. But
yes, and while they said it wasn't manifestly excessive between 15 and 13, looking at it from the perspective of a 17-year-old, this is my first offense, and I'm about to face now 15 years. That 2 years means a lot to me.
It does.
It does. And I feel as though as they would have said, where's the judicial discretion there to adjust the sentence in that way? That would have been the sentence he received. So,
and I want to say, Jade, for those who are listening in, I know sometimes people hear human rights and call us bleeding hearts and these terms. And I'm a bleeding heart. I proudly say that. I think empathy is good in life at all times. But we are not oblivious to what is happening on the ground. All we're saying is this. The law is there already. Allow the judge that latitude to make the decision. And we're not saying that judges can't make errors. One may not agree with this power, but the DPP has it, the right to appeal.
Yes.
So if it is that the Director of Public Prosecution believes that the judges made an error of judgment in any particular case, they can appeal that matter. So when you have those safeguards, and as I tell you, I personally don't agree with that carte blanche power at all, because I think it goes against the constitutional right that we have not to be tried for the same offense twice. Double jeopardy, as some of you may know it, when you watch cable news, you may not know the constitutional rights that you have, but you watch TV and you know the essence of what I'm saying.
Yes.
So I may not agree with it, but it does exist. Yes? And if it is that an judge makes an error, then again, the right to appeal is there from the DPP. So, I mean, we have several safeguards that need to be considered, but it goes back to the core of what we're saying. Balancing the best interests of the child with public safety. And I can't say in all circumstances that the best interests of the child will demand, for example, with murder, that you automatically lock up that child for 20 years.
Yes.
And there's no guarantee that parole will be given after that 20-year period, because they're sending them to training school to go mix up with bigger, tough, hard criminal that a child may go in there for the first offense, and by the time they mix up with these hard criminals and so on, they come out tougher than they went in. So again, training school is where you're sending them to.
Yes.
Right? So I think all of these factors and issues, you have to think about it while we clamor and ask for more. Because I tell you, the crime rate is frightening.
Yes, we've always maintained, there has to be a response to our alarming crime rate. However, we want the response to be holistic because we want it to last.
Is. And one of the things I want to plug, and in another minute, because I have to be watching the clock. I love the expo. I did. I saw the smiles on the little children's faces. It was a beautiful event. But I like sustainable strategies.
Yes.
And some things are not that beautiful of a display, but it works. And DSP spoke about some of them that the JCF is doing. Social media posts are good, but I also love community interventions.
Absolutely.
And I want to see the community safety and security branch, and I hope we can meet with the different leads in the JCF to talk about what exactly is being done, what their roles are in terms of the police providing mentorship support to some of the youngsters to divert them away from crime. The police is doing excellent work with the Domestic Violence Intervention Center. How can you replicate that and scale it up in some of the at-risk communities a little bit more? The football games, the real community transformation is where we want to go. So that's what I really want. So the expo was nice. It was a nice display, but I like routine things on a smaller scale. Not to say the expo wasn't good, don't get me wrong. And I think it ought to be repeated next year. But I want mentorship programs that divert children from crime, and it really fosters that reporting mechanism from the community, and it builds that trust between citizen and police.
Yes, building a rapport with the communities that you're in, I think, is something that will greatly benefit both the communities but also the force as well. Just getting the job done. Okay, so we are basically at the end of the show. Our trivia question for this week was, what was the minimum sentence for rape before you can be considered for parole? We did not get the correct answer as I last checked. The correct answer is 15 years.
Yes.
But I think our first responder was a bit confused because they did start out by saying minimum 15 years.
I think they may have read another offense.
And then read another offense. Yes, they kind of conflated two offenses and then said minimum 10 years. So the 15 years was correct. So you were right in your first stead.
But what's the maximum allowed?
Okay, so the maximum allowed is life imprisonment.
And the reason I asked, Jade, because, a number of these cases shock public conscience, and I hear people say, rapists to get away and so on. And I want to say it's life imprisonment.
Yes.
And so we have to be looking at things like that. And no, we don't support death penalty, no matter the circumstance.
Absolutely.
All right.
All right, so thank you for joining us. We'll be back next week, same time, but it's a holiday, so we may be giving you a little of a rerun.
I won't be here next week. I will be laboring, so Jade alone can be here next week,
Our
Tuesday.
time slot will be filled next week, Tuesday, so please tune in as normal, and you'll hear from us both.
You'll hear a repeated show. Have a good Tuesday.
All right.
Bye-bye.